This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
This is Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And this is Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. And this is Unholy.
So we're talking just after the news has come here of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We're just in the immediate aftermath of that. We had some of our conversation before this happened, but we're now talking quite late at night on Thursday as this news is sort of sinking in. And I mean, I was down outside Buckingham Palace just a while ago, and it was one of those moments where you realize she was obviously the queen of this country, but the interest in her is global. It was like one of those scenes that is now quite a cliched scene in the movies where you have a lineup of TV reporters speaking in every language in the world. As I walked along, you could hear French and Italian and German, obviously, but Arabic and Mandarin and Greek and so on.
Hebrew.
And Hebrew, indeed. One of the reasons why I was down there was so that I could talk to you, Yonit, on your broadcast.
I was waiting for you to say that.
Yeah, and a great pleasure it was, and a privilege it was too. But yeah, it's a very, very clear realization that, this country had a change of prime minister this week, and there was not that lineup of international reporters for that. The Queen had a singular meaning, obviously, in this country, and we might talk about that, but she was also a global figure.
Yes, and you think of the world we live in, right? Everything is constantly changing, and no one agrees about anything with anyone else. And it's so hectic. And there is this one figure that you look at and you kind of feel like, okay, she's always going to be there. And she is a consensus, even, and we talked about this, within the community that doesn't support the monarchy. But there is something about her, about that ability to hold on and, not only the longevity, but the sensibility and the elegance and the intelligence and even the humor that she had, it's a strange thing to feel. I mean, it really does obviously feel like, because it is an end of an era, but you think of the country you live in that is heading towards really immense challenges. And this is, that affects everyone's mood. Not only in the United Kingdom, obviously. Yeah.
I mean, I do wonder for this country, actually. It is going into a very, very difficult autumn, huge economic crisis, political instability, 4 prime ministers in the last 6 years. And a lot of that was possible, all of the churn over Brexit and so on. The fate of the union itself. Is Scotland going to break away? All of that was, in a way, containable because there was one constant sort of North Star that stayed in place. And so therefore, the world around it could orbit around and whiz around crazily. And that's constant, that point of certainty was her, and that's because two things, I think. I mean, the first thing is simple chronology, just the idea of someone around for 70 years, and so that she was not just the Queen, obviously, for all of my life, but for most of, my late parents' life, and for, a good chunk of my long late grandmother's life, So there's something about the idea of a person who was around, and not just around, but head of state in 1952 and now, means that there's something just reliable about that, like the weather or something that you can just, is there as part of the British landscape. But the other thing I think is relevant, we keep on one way or another, you and I, in our conversations, we so often go back to the events of the Second World War. And that's, when we've been talking about Ukraine or Putin or Jewish things, it so often comes back to that event. And for Britain, for modern Britain, the sort of foundational event, the creation myth almost, what 1776 is to the Americans, 1940 is to the Brits, the moment of Britain standing alone against fascism, against tyranny, against Nazism. Yes, Winston Churchill was brilliant at creating myths, but this notion that this was our finest hour, Britain standing alone, that has become the sort of foundation stone for modern Britain. Now, who embodied that in British life? There was only one person left who was a direct human link to those events, and that was her. She was, literally on the balcony in 1945 when Winston Churchill on V-Day, Victory in Europe Day, stood there. Next to him was the king, but also the two young princesses, Princess Elizabeth and Margaret. She's there. That movie, The King's Speech, all about that momentous speech that George VI had to give to stiffen the resolve of the country. In the movie, when he finishes the speech about the war against Hitler, who runs up and gives him a cuddle? It's Elizabeth. She's part of the founding myths. It's as if, in today's America, there was someone who was around at the signing of the Declaration of Independence or something. That's the kind of meaning. And I think that is why this will be such a significant landmark. In some ways, the end of post-war Britain has come today. And that's a big milestone for this country. And I don't think it's really hit people how big a thing this is going to be in the coming days.
You mentioned Winston Churchill. I remember that magnificent play, The Audience. And I think it's also true not only in the play that she had, obviously she has to remain neutral and not show her opinions. I think she had, it's safe to say, two favorite prime ministers out of the 15 she met, the last of which only 2 days ago, Liz Truss. And it's Winston Churchill and Harold Wilson, two different people, obviously of two different political parties. And I think it says something about her, that she could connect to, different worldviews, different people. Some of them probably looked at her when she just started out as this young woman in a world where, even today it's hard to be a young woman in a representative role. But then I could only imagine what was going through her head and what she had to go through to kind of find her fortitude and say, I'm the monarch. It's not an easy thing to go through.
No, I mean, what's fascinating about that is feminism has never really known what to make of the Queen. And that's partly because she draws on a much earlier tradition in this country. And there is one, which is odd for a country that you wouldn't hold up as some beacon of women's rights. But she's in a line that has Victoria as the dominant figure of the 19th century and Elizabeth as the dominant figure of her period, which I know you know so well and are a keen student of. And so she was tapping into some much deeper, almost ancestral notion of, women's empowerment before the kind of current iteration of that, the feminist iteration of that. She, something that goes back to sort of Baudelaire or something. She was tapping into that, but she also, it mutated in later years so that she did become this matriarchal figure. And, it's quite interesting seeing the sort of Jewish reactions to this as if, we know about matriarchs and all of that. But it was a different model, tapped into, as I say, something very deep. She connected Britons to their history. And I wonder how Britons will fare without that. When they saw her, they could see themselves in a line that went to Victoria and Elizabeth. They could see the connection to the 1940, to Churchill, as literally her first prime minister. She had 15, as you say. Winston Churchill was the first, Liz Truss the last. I wonder how it will feel without that sort of thick cord that tied this generation with its past. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the feminism. I think about that. And I remember that quote, I hope I'm quoting it correctly, by Elizabeth I, right? She said, I had the body of a feeble woman, but the strength and courage of a king. And I wonder what went through Elizabeth II's mind in that regard. I mean, was it the same kind of thinking? Because she was, in many ways, maybe she wouldn't call herself a feminist, but I think in many ways, I mean, if you are someone who in some way, formulates and is the head of state, but you're also, a monarch that is so dominant, then you are in many ways a feminist even if you don't call yourself that.
Yeah. There will there will be lots written on this line, how she saw it. I think the interesting thing is that she, when I talked before about empowerment, I don't think she used the language of power. And that's partly because she recognized this was a constitutional monarchy. A really interesting thing to think about with her is she was in the business of saving the monarchy. What people often said who knew her well said the animating, defining event of her lifetime, not her adult lifetime, was the abdication in 1936 of Edward VIII, her uncle, who only did the job for 8 months, who, for one thing, there was a resentment of him because him stepping down dropped her father in it, who didn't want to do the job. But her view, I am, led to believe by all people who knew her well, was that that was a trauma for the royal family and put the royal family in jeopardy. That if you suddenly had an institution that people could opt in or opt out of, then people might, the whole game would be up. Well, in that case, it loses all its kind of magic mystique. So she was in the business of thinking that can never, ever happen again. You can have survive one abdication every 500 years tops. And that's why she went on till her dying breath. She felt that the job was service. And it is very moving hearing the speech she gave, even as a princess in 1947, where she more or less says, I will be devoted to your service. And she repeated this word. Even very recently, she signed off a statement, your servant. That is a really unusual idea now in an era of celebrity and sort of narcissism. That is such an interesting and different idea. But I think she thought, without that, you don't secure the monarchy. And let's face it, when she was born, there were lots of crowned heads in Europe, and now there are almost none. And how did that happen? She realized this was an institution that needed to be saved. And she did it incredibly effectively so that people who, are reformers, and I myself wrote a book 20 odd years ago calling for Britain to become a republic. We got very little traction and headway because of her, because people looked at her and thought, well, any system that gets her as head of state can't be that bad. And because she was exceptionally good at it.
Yep. And the legacy, obviously, also things that she said in Glasgow just recently, a video conference, but she said, we're not going to live, none of us are going to live forever. And you have to think about this, and you have to think about the next generations. And she thought about that. And as you said, her preserving the monarchy was crucial for her. Another open question, right? How effective will it be? Will this royal family be without her? And now, Jonathan, to the rest of our program, which we recorded earlier on Thursday.
We should talk about your neck of the woods and a big development, which you have to say didn't happen exactly speedily or with efficiency. And that is, after 4 months, the Israeli authorities have finally delivered a report on the killing of Shireeb Abu Akleh, the Al Jazeera journalist, crucially both a Palestinian and American citizen, who was shot dead doing her job reporting in Jenin. People around the world have blamed the Israeli military for her death. Israel's initial statements was no, it could have been someone else. It could have been Palestinians. It could have been caught in crossfire. But now a report, and Yonit, we have a guest joining us who really can shed expert light on all of this.
Amos Harel is the military and defense analyst for Haaretz newspaper. He's one of the sharpest minds, not only in Israel, but in the world, thinking about these issues. He's also the winner of the prestigious Sokolov Prize for Journalism and author of 3 best-selling books. Most importantly, after saying all this, he is a good friend of our pod. And Amos, we're really glad that you could join us today.
Hello, thank you.
Israel, after almost 4 months, issued its conclusions about the killing of Al Jazeera journalist Shireeb Abu Akleh, admitting it's highly probable that it was an Israeli soldier who mistakenly killed her. But it couldn't be unequivocally determined. But this is what Israel said, again, after almost 4 months. Isn't this a version that Israel could have just published a day after the tragedy?
Well, maybe not a day, but this was a typical Hasbara trap. A typical way of Israel to mismanage a huge PR disaster. And not for the first time, as you've mentioned. I think most of the facts of the event were quite understood very soon. But somewhat typically, Israeli official speakers all tended to pass the blame to the other side, not only to say that this needed to be investigated and then we'll find the true details and tell the world about it, but also almost immediately to blame the Palestinians and even the journalist herself as being reckless, as being not cautious enough while getting close to Israeli units and so on. In the end, I think that Israel has a point when it claims that there's no proof that somebody did this intentionally. And being there and covering similar situations in the past, I tend to at least give some credibility to the Israeli version, saying no soldier has done this intentionally. But saying immediately that it was the other side's fault, and immediately saying that since she was working for Al Jazeera, then she's a terrorist collaborator or anything like that. And we've heard some terrible responses, both from official Israeli speakers and some Israeli journalists, especially from the right wing as well. That was bound to end in a miserable way. There was no way on earth that Israel could come out well out of such a situation. But to do the exact opposite and to start passing the blame to the Palestinian side was a giant mistake in my view.
But even now, in this report, the authorities keep open the possibility that there was an exchange of fire and that was possibly what led to her death. And people around the world have said that is implausible. And I want to read you the words of commentator Mohammed Shahada, who said, "It's entirely preposterous to maintain such a claim in the face of independent investigations by the Associated Press, Bellingcat, CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, that all concluded that there was no exchange of fire, no fire exchange at the time of her death, and that there was no Palestinian militants near her when she was hit." So that is the conclusion that all those big news organizations have come to. And yet this Israeli, as it were, internal investigation still keeps alive that possibility. Does it mean that these findings are just not going to be deemed credible?
I think Israel is fighting a losing battle to begin with. It's very hard to explain, especially in the West, the activities of an Israeli military operating inside densely populated Palestinian refugee camp. It's hard to explain the background. It's hard to explain the fact that people coming from this specific refugee camp were involved in terrorist attacks in Israel a month before the incident. And I think there was a justification from the Israeli point of view to actually operate there under the circumstances which none of us like. On the other hand, trying to explain this abroad, especially using all those Hasbara tricks, is bound to fail. I don't think that anybody in the West would understand or support the Israeli position. Having said that, unfortunately, we know that journalists are many times and in many places in the line of fire. It's not the first place in the world that this has happened. There were dozens of journalists who were injured or even died, even this year, in all sorts of places, Ukraine and other conflicts around the world. And again, I have to repeat my assessment that I haven't seen any proof that this was done intentionally. And since I've been to the same place in Jenin, although at night, on a night raid in early March, but I've accompanied the IDF on a similar operation, I've seen how hard it is to actually see what's going on from inside an armored jeep. Even if you use a marksman, even if you use somebody who operates with some kind of sight on his weapon and so on, the line of sight is very, very difficult. It's very hard to see who is exactly in front of you. And therefore, some of the assumptions that this specific soldier knew that this was a journalist and intentionally decided to kill her because, I don't know, because of hatred towards Palestinians or Al Jazeera or whatever, I haven't seen any proof that this has happened. It has happened in the past, not with journalists, but with unarmed civilians or neutralized terrorists or whatever you'd like to call them. If you go back to the Azaria case, which shattered the whole Israeli society in 2015, in that case, it was very, very clear. There was a young Palestinian man who stabbed two soldiers, was injured, was lying unconscious and wounded on the floor, and you had an Israeli a soldier in front of the cameras shooting him in cold blood. This caused quite a storm, and we could see the rift inside Israeli society, in which, on the one hand, the army's top brass and even the defense minister, and to some extent, even Prime Minister Netanyahu, were saying, look, this is not who we are, this is not how we behave, and this soldier would be put on trial. On the other hand, we've seen the majority of the Israeli society, according to all public opinion polls, saying, this is our collective son. Even if he has made a mistake, he's still ours, and we support him come what may. I think this case is slightly different. Of course, it brings about a lot more public attention in the West because she was a journalist, because she was an American citizen as well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned her being an American citizen. I want to pull on that thread for a minute because we saw the United States saying that it would urge Israel, it said it on Tuesday, urge Israel to reconsider its rules of engagement to prevent similar incidents from happening. Lapid and Gantz quite forcefully responding to this. Obviously, we're in an election season saying, we won't allow them to put an IDF soldier on trial and no one's going to tell us how to, decide on our rules of engagement. By the way, a logical statement for a sovereign state. Can you sort of walk us through this? Is this a real crisis right now between the United States and Israel, or is this a lot of internal politics on the Israeli side, playing out on the international stage as well?
I think this is somewhat convenient to both sides. We have to remember, this is a liberal democratic administration in the United States. Trump didn't care one bit whether Palestinians were killed in the West Bank and under which circumstances. The Biden administration has to act differently. In a way, it's an extension of the Obama administration's attitude towards Israel. And since Biden is doing absolutely nothing about the peace process, and he's only paid lip service to the possible future of a peaceful relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians, this is an area which is convenient for the Americans to operate. They criticize Israel, they expect Israel to behave better, and so on. And since, in this case, Shireen was both a journalist and an American citizen, I think this was, to some extent, expected that there will be a similar response from the State Department. On the other hand, we have to remember that both Lapid and Gantz are running up for office. The 1st of November, of course, you've mentioned that, I believe, in your podcast.
Once or twice.
Another round. Yeah, we're going to face another round of elections. Lapid, to begin with, is criticized by the right wing, and a lot of Israeli citizens, a lot of Israeli voters somehow doubt They doubt that he's actually fit for the job to make life and death decisions on matter of security. The right wing keeps pointing out to the fact that he was only a military journalist in his army service and so on. This is his chance to support the troops, to say we're fully behind the IDF Chief of Staff Kochavi. We won't let any other friendly nation intervene with the way we conduct our troops in the West Bank with rules of engagement and so on. Gantz took exactly the same stance yesterday. It was as if they were speaking from the same page. But I don't think that this will become a major issue between the two states right now. We saw the State Department's response immediately after Lapid and Gantz criticized them. We saw the Americans taking one or two steps back. I don't think that this is becoming a major point of conflict. It's the Americans doing lip service to the cause of fighting the occupation and criticizing Israel, but nothing bigger than that at the moment.
Would it be too cynical, Amos, to suspect that the entire sequence was choreographed in advance so that Biden and Lapid agree, look, I will give you this slap on the wrist, you will give me a slap on the wrist back, and then both of us can turn to our respective publics and say, yeah, we did what you expected us to do, and now the relationship continues as before?
Look, Jonathan, I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not sure that both sides are that good in handling these matters, especially the current Israeli government. But other than that, yes, I think it's very convenient for both sides. Everybody has a part to play. Nothing has changed much. And for the time being, Lapid, his hope is to somehow slide through this next period of 7.5 weeks with no major military conflicts, no major failures on the different strategic arenas in order to arrive safe and sound in 1st of November and hope for at least for a draw with Netanyahu.
I mean, let's talk about that a little bit and that point of friction maybe between defense and politics. I mean, obviously, Lapid and Gantz, there's no love lost between those two, and that's to put it mildly. Both are trying to become prime minister in November 1st. One is the prime minister, one is the defense minister. How does that actually work between them? Are they cooperating well? Does Lapid delegate all of the authority on these matters to Gantz himself? I mean, how does that work?
Look, it works okay when you compare that to Netanyahu and Gantz. I mean, the animosity between Netanyahu and Gantz, I assume, was even greater considering the last months of Netanyahu's government. Having said that, as you've mentioned, there's quite a lot of bad blood between Lapid and Gantz, especially over the period of time in the beginning of the pandemic. You remember when Gantz and Ashkenazi decided, as part of the Blue and White Party, to join Netanyahu's government, and Lapid and Ya'alon went the other way. Gantz does not really think highly of Lapid's capability as a prime minister or Lapid's preparedness to deal with such important matters as peace and war and so on. Other than that, I think Lapid is taking a step back whenever it comes to handling the day-to-day issues. The best example for that was the operation in Gaza last month. You could see that it was handled by Gantz and Kochavi mostly, and not so much by Lapid himself. He makes the public appearances. He makes a point of having close discussions, which are somehow filmed, at least the openings of these discussions with the chief of Mossad, David Barnea, and so on. He seems to have a sort of a hands-on attitude towards the Iranian issue, which is considered, the main event. But other than that, when it comes to handling the daily business of fighting Palestinians in the West Bank or making decisions about Air Force attacks, airstrikes in Syria, and so on, I think he prefers to leave that business to Gantz, hoping that A, nothing serious happens, and B, if something does fail, that most of the fingers would be pointed to Gantz and not to himself.
It's fascinating, the politics of that, and you've explained it. Before we leave the substance, though, of the Shireeb Abu Akleh case, just sort of one specific point about that and one large one. The specific point, I suppose, is just this thing, again, it's about how this plays partly in Western public opinion. You were making the point that, of course, the report says the soldier did not deliberately target a journalist, but I think the report went further and said that the soldier could not possibly have known he was hitting a journalist. And that is the thing that I think people outside think is implausible. So I'd just like your sort of reaction on that. And the larger point, and they're related, are these figures which tell us that, since January of this year, over 80 Palestinians have been killed. Most of them, Israel said, were fighters, but there were definitely civilians in there as well. Obviously 20 Israelis too, some mixture of civilians and soldiers killed in combat. But putting the two things together, people do wonder, that number looks high, and people say, does that mean conflict is, escalating, violence is exploding? Or, and this goes back to the point about the killing of a journalist, are the military being less careful? I mean, and even the phrase is used, trigger happy, to the point where somebody can be, killing a journalist doing her job. I know those are two things, but I think they're related because they're about the degree of sort of care that is being used here.
Okay, I'll try to separate my answer to two different questions. First of all, regarding the incident, I think that the army may be slightly going too far in its defense of the actual soldier, saying that there was no way he could see. I don't know. As I've told you, I've been not as a soldier, but as a journalist, I've been to a similar situation. I saw soldiers shooting from inside the Jeep in which I was traveling, and I saw how hard it was to actually make the distinction between civilians and fighters, especially at night, but even when there is daylight around. If you look at the terrain, if you see how populated, how close everything is, and you consider the fact that there was some fighting exchange, some fire was exchanged earlier, then I think you can understand the difficulties of people operating under these circumstances. It's true.
And even when they're identified as press on their...
Yes, when it's 250 or 240 yards away, and considering everything else that was going on. Look, I'm not objective about this. I'm an Israeli. I served in the army in the past. I can't tell you for sure that I know exactly what happened, and that I'm not watching this from New York or anywhere else. I sit in Tel Aviv, and you stand where you sit on these issues. But other than that, I think that, again, it's what I call the Hasbara trap. They're so keen on defending the Israeli position, which is sometimes very hard to defend, that they go through some illogical explanations sometimes. Regarding the bigger picture, look, we've seen this wave of attacks that began late in March. This is not done top down, but actually bottom up. These are, if you like, it's sort of a grassroots movement, a very armed grassroots movement. These are not members of the Palestinian Authority security forces, not members of the Fatah, of the PLO, not even members in most cases of Islamic Jihad and Hamas. These are young men very frustrated with the daily circumstances, having no belief whatsoever in Israel or the regime of Mahmoud Abbas, who's 86 years old and hardly communicates with them. And they are eager to fight. In some of these cases, people go to Tel Aviv or Bnei Brak and murder innocent civilians. In others, once the IDF comes knocking and tries to make arrests of these suspects, people, in their view, are defending their homes. And these are dozens and dozens. It's believed that in Nablus, for instance, there were more than 200 gunmen involved in the latest rounds of events when there were military operations there. So under these circumstances, a lot of people get killed. Again, the fact that Israeli soldiers are defended and are operating from within heavily armored jeeps means that there are not many casualties on the Israeli side among soldiers and policemen and so on. But almost every day, including the previous night between Wednesday and Thursday, Palestinians are getting killed in those fights. I think that 70 to 80% of these cases, these are actually armed men, and you can see their posters later on and the photographs and what's been published in social media and so on. You can see them with their M16s or with the Kalashnikovs, the AK-47s and so on. But yes, sometimes innocent bystanders get killed as well. There are these cases. I think that Israel should be more cautious when it applies force. And I think that there's a bigger question as well. The IDF is always concerned regarding preventing the next attack. But we have to also look at the fact that maybe our actions are contributing to the whole situation. You cannot only blame the Palestinians for not doing enough. You have to ask yourself, how has Israel treated the Palestinian Authority? Wasn't Abbas's regime, hasn't it become a sort of an Israeli subcontractor for security and nothing more than that? So the frustration on the Palestinian side is rather clear. And I think that the fact that the army, in its view, it has to send those troops in every day because there's information about upcoming attacks. But in the end, I think that in some way, we're actually contributing to this becoming a bigger deal. And I think that there's a possibility that there will be a massive operation in the northern West Bank sometime in the next month or so around Jenin. There's also a possibility of some kind of escalation over the Temple Mount during the Jewish holidays, which are late September and early October. So this is becoming quite dangerous to all sides involved, especially, as I mentioned, Lapid and Gantz's parties who are going to elections by November 1st.
Just before we let you go, Amos, some fascinating reporting from you earlier this week suggesting the American embassy in Israel has been asked to prepare a report on a part of the Israeli army that I think will fascinate people outside the country, just even its existence, that the Israeli army has a battalion, Netza Yehuda, made up of ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, which has been, I know, mired in some controversy. Just tell us what your reporting was, but also just about this battalion, which, as I say, I think will fascinate people outside the country.
Okay, this battalion was established in 98 or 99 as a way to convince some young Haredi men to enlist to the army and to take their share of the collective burden, if you like, of military service. So every year there are a few hundred young men who come from ultra-Orthodox community who actually they volunteer to the army because they could be exempted, and they join the army. The problem is usually that they don't get the actual numbers they want, and in order for this battalion to exist, they have to enlist more men. Some of them are very, very religious, but not Haredi, not ultra-Orthodox, but in fact Zionist religious. Some of them even coming from settlements or what we call the hilltops youth, the guys in illegal outposts and so on. And during the years in this battalion, we've seen quite a high number of incidents in which they either treated Palestinians badly, hit Palestinians, shot Palestinians when this is what was necessary. I think it's out of the ordinary. It's not the usual conduct of most IDF units. It's not that far away, but there are more cases, more incidents which the army treats in disciplinary ways and so on. There have been a few reports in recent months of such incidents. The most significant one was an 80-year-old man who was detained by those soldiers near Ramallah and later died. It also turned out that he was an American citizen. And this is, I think, what got Washington interested. And recently, analysts in the American embassy in Jerusalem began interviewing both Israelis and Palestinians about the conduct of that battalion, even suggesting that maybe the Americans would apply some pressure on the IDF to pull the battalion out of the West Bank, send them somewhere else in order to prevent such incidents. I think it's quite a rare case in which the Americans intervene in such a way. It's somewhat connected to what we mentioned before, their response, the State Department response to the investigation regarding Shireeb Abu Akleh. Again, it will give the Israeli politicians an opportunity to say we're defending our troops and we'll not let foreign forces interfere and so on. It's a very interesting story, both the battalion and the actual fact that the Americans are involved in this, but I don't think it will change much on the ground.
Amos, we could go on forever talking to you, but we kind of acknowledge the fact that you have actually a job to do. So we thank you very much. And something tells me we will find a good enough excuse to bring you on again. Thank you so much for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Always good to hear from Amos Harel, who is absolutely the preeminent journalist in his field. Tremendous insight from him, as always.
I agree. I actually particularly enjoyed listening to you two talk in that conversation. But yeah, we have some more Israeli politics to discuss, Jonathan. Who would believe it? We talked about a little bit about Lapid and Gantz in our conversation with Amos. And last time, I think we focused a lot about the Ben Gvir phenomenon. This week, if I may, we're 53 days to elections. I want to talk a little bit about Avigdor Lieberman. And now I want to talk about him because this week a story came out on Channel 13, our competing channel, that aired allegations by a former activist in Lieberman's Israel Beitenu party. Really, Jonathan, you think like you believe you've seen everything in Israeli politics, but this man went on air claiming that Lieberman asked him to kill a police major general in exchange for money. He said, I'd pay you this to kill someone. And this was 20 years ago. This is quite an amazing story. I should say that it was generally been met with a heavy dose of skepticism because, all sorts of questions like why come forward now has been obviously vehemently denied by Lieberman himself, who's also suing him after what he said. And he's basically, Lieberman putting the blame on Netanyahu, saying this is part of a Netanyahu smear campaign. Let's just pause on that for a minute. I mean, think of these two men, right? Lieberman was Netanyahu's right-hand man for years. He built the brand that is Netanyahu, only to change sides and become his bitter critic. Lieberman's surprise decision in 2019 not to join Netanyahu's coalition is basically what started Netanyahu's downward spiral. So this is a very interesting individual. Also, we should probably mention very, very anti-Arab. He used to talk about Israeli Arabs in the worst possible way and say that they need to move to the West Bank. He completely changed his tune on this, right? I mean, he's the minister who sat in the government with the first Arab Israeli party. Now he's changed his rhetoric to being a more anti-Haredi rhetoric. But the interesting question here, of course, is also what is happening to the Russian voice, what we used to call the Russian vote in Israel. This is a very interesting question as we move forward toward these elections.
The Russian angle on this is the thing that came into my mind as soon as I heard about this story, because it seemed to me that, I don't know the truth of this claim or not, but it kind of rests on, in a way, a kind of stereotype, a prejudice about Russians. Let's remember that Avigdor Lieberman was always described in all profiles. The first line would mention that he was a former nightclub bouncer. And there is just something of that archetype that fits, that makes it, believable that, with all the stories about Russian mafia, etc., that it makes it at least plausible that someone would claim that he plotted to have somebody rubbed out, to bump off somebody who was in his way. It plays into that body of stereotypes about Russians that exist. So that immediately leapt out of me. But yeah, I think the question you raise about what happens to the Russian voice is fascinating. I remember when as we then described it, the Soviet Aliyah, Jews from the Soviet Union were either coming or were expected to come to Israel. And it's very much in our minds in the week after Gorbachev's death, as the Soviet Union was breaking up. I remember people on the left of politics in Israel saying, in a way, quite a racist assumption, actually. People who had seen a lot of Mizrahi voters go for the right, for the Likud, thinking, now we're going to get all these Russian intellectuals who love reading Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. These Jews are going to come here, and of course they'll rally to us. This will build up again the kind of mainly Ashkenazi Labour Party, that part of Israel that had been shrinking demographically. This is going to be great news for us. Wrong. His Russian voters came over, and it turned out they didn't like anything that smacked of socialism and, the kibbutz movement and all its history sounded to them like collective farms. They wanted nothing to do with it, and they went rightward and became voters for the right, and often quite for the hard right. And just as you mentioned, Lieberman's anti-Arab politics, all of which is a way of saying 30 years on, where do you think those Russian-born or Russian heritage voters are going to cast their lot?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, it's totally fascinating, and you mentioned and you talked about that, right? About how they turned most of this immigration. We're talking about 1 million people, all in all, which really is a huge societal change in a country of merely 9 million. A lot of them turned out to be right-wing voters, not only because of the reasons that you mentioned, but also because they didn't like the idea of making concessions to anyone, not to the Palestinians, not to anyone else. Now we are talking about, I think we can generally say that the Russian vote has turned into the Israeli vote, right? These million first generation, second generation immigrants are now completely integrated into Israeli society. So it's not like what you need is what once we thought, right? You need a party that the head of the party will be a Russian immigrant like Lieberman or like Sharansky in the past, and they will bring in the Russian vote. That's less and less of that. But also we are forgetting the important element in what happened in this past year, and that is the war in Ukraine. And this will have, many analysts believe, a major effect on what we still call the Russian vote, because many of these voters are anti-Putin. Many of them oppose what he's doing in Ukraine. A lot of them, by the way, there were about 150,000 who came after the annexation of Crimea, and they see Lieberman particularly as someone who admires Putin, right, who has very strong connections to Russia. I will just remind you that after the massacre in Bucha, right, and we were talking about this a lot, about how Israel being very careful not to talk against Russia, but Lapid himself, castigating Russia after this massacre. Lieberman came out and said something like, there are bad people on both sides. I kid you not. I mean, this is what he said. He said there are accusations. Russia's making accusations. Ukraine is making accusations. We don't know the full picture. Something like that. That came out, pretty, that was a remarkable statement on his part. So he's seen as someone who's very pro-Putin. That might hurt him with his own constituency. By the way, so is Netanyahu seen pretty pro-Putin, although a lot of the Russian vote, we're talking about 14 mandates if they all come out to vote. That's a lot. A lot of them, our vote is still voting Likud, but also Yesh Atid, which is important because Lapid himself was very anti-Russia in this war in Ukraine. So I think it's also a very important question, what will happen with the Russian vote vis-a-vis this story.
And the generational point, I suppose, is that the younger generation is less Russian and more Israeli. Right. And I would guess that those Jews who do have some kind of strongman appeal to or affinity with Putin would be the older ones, and younger ones would be against Putin and against the war. Can I have permission to tell one little anecdote which actually sheds light, I think, a little bit on this point I was making about political affiliation? So in 1988, I made my first visit to Moscow, and like lots of other Jewish students my age, I was there in part to visit Soviet Jews who had been refused permission to leave the country. I'd been given a whole lot of stuff, material to give them, to Jewish prayer books and other things. But amongst them was some stuff about, pictures, calendars of Israel. And this was when I got the first intimation that these people are not going to be the voters that, many in Israel expected. I pulled out one of these calendars, and in it was a picture, a classic sort of kibbutz image of like a tractor in a field. Mm-hmm. And I remember the face of the woman I was showing to fell. And she thought, oh no, Israel is going to be exactly like here, with these propagandistic images of tractors and collective farms and so on. And I thought they want to run a mile from anything that smacks of that. And yet the old Israeli Labour Party had kind of quite an old Soviet vibe about it, with kibbutz and the sort of, workers toiling in the fields, etc. That's when I realized, actually, of course, this group is going to rebel and recoil from anything that smacks of old-fashioned left, and they will be voters for the right. So I had a little clue of that all those years ago.
We should hand out some awards, my British friend.
We should. Shall I begin with a Mensch
Yes,
award?
I think that's good.
This week. I don't often, and we don't often talk about the Women's National Basketball Association League of the United States, the WNBA. But this week saw the retirement after a stellar 19 years, all of which spent with the Seattle Storm, of Sue Bird, a phenomenally accomplished competitor in the sport of women's basketball. She won 4 titles, 5 Olympic gold medals, 41 years old now and retiring, but she is a Jewish basketball player, a Jewish hooper. Is that the right word? And she has done extraordinarily well as an athlete, but something of a role model to young women and girls who play the game, partly because she was unabashedly out and proud in her Jewish identity, raised in both Catholic and Jewish upbringings, but at one point applied for Israeli citizenship and unabashed, as I said, in her identity. And that was inspirational for many young girls and women playing the game and playing sports generally, to see someone who celebrated their identity in that way. So we wish a happy retirement to Sue Bird, and she is our Mensch of the week.
We can add Serena Williams to the same story, but I like the fact that you chose her.
We could. You mean a little-known Serena Williams athlete also retired this week, and when all the world was paying attention, to Sue Bird, we find Roman unholy for a struggling up-and-coming tennis player by the name of Serena Williams, who also put down she put down her racket. Yes, we can give her an honourable mention this week.
Just thought we'd mention that. Okay, Chutzpah Award of the Week. I have to admit, I'm a little bit torn on this, because I'm not sure it's one of these stories that you're not really sure if you want to put it in the Mensch Award or the Chutzpah Award, because I think we can make the case for both. But okay, I will talk about Nobel laureate for physics, Giorgio Parisi. He is a professor, and he spoke to Italians this week and tried to convince them of a new way to cook pasta to reduce the energy bills. It's called passive pasta. We'll just say that you can boil the water, turn off the gas halfway, and let it cook itself. Some people in Italy would consider this sacrilegious, to be honest. But, this obviously created quite a ruckus in the country. And this is what Italians were all talking about. So I'm a little bit torn if you give him the Chutzpah Award or the Mensch Award. And I was especially torn because I was trying to find the Italian phrase for chutzpah, which is very, very, very difficult to do. But
if anybody could find that, it would be you.
Yeah, so we're trying. I'm expanding our listenership here. I'm talking to our Italian community, if you don't mind. No, but I was thinking. I think at the end of the day, il premio della vergogna, which means sort of the award for embarrassment, insult, or something like that, would probably be the right thing to say. But I was thinking about this a lot.
A worthy winner, I think. Now, Ms. Levy.
Yes, sir.
You and your tribe have made the news this week. I'm going to leave it to you to tell us this new claim to fame for your, tribe is the right word. One of the 12 tribes, the Levites. They're big. Tell us about it.
We're very big, Jonathan. I realize it took you a long time to figure this out, but I would just quote for you a tweet by Gil Hoffman. He's a former Jerusalem Post political analyst. And this is what he wrote on Twitter. I just have to read it out to you. I'll do it slowly, because I'm enjoying it. For anyone else who cares about what tribes lead Israel, he writes, if Netanyahu returns to power, for the first time ever, the Jewish state will have a prime minister, a president, Isaac Herzog, and an IDF chief of staff appointed this week, Herzi Halevi, who are all Levites. We rule, my friends. That's all I wanted to say. Not only religious duties, we also rock in other aspects. And I remind you, we were not given any land, so we had a tough time, but we still managed to be very successful.
Yeah, no, I'm impressed. And you failed to mention the role, which is part of the Israeli constitution, of lead TV journalist and news anchor. That is also held by the Levies or Levites. You've done very well. Cohens, you need to sharpen up your act.
You do.
You know, you're lagging. As for the rest of us, who are designated just people of Israel, isn't it?
You know, to be honest, like Maimonides used to say that you're all okay, but you're all, he used to say that everyone can achieve greatness, but it's not true. It's only us, to be honest.
We'll have to smarten up our act, fellow non-Levites, non-Cohens. This has been Unholy. If you are enjoying it, remember to spread the word on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever is your social media platform of choice. Or you could just go old school and tell your friends and family, hey, you should be listening to Unholy. What's wrong with you? Put it on. Who do we thank, Yonit?
Guy Glaser, Omer Primat, Rom Atik, Yair Bashan, Jonathan. We will meet next week.
We will. Look forward to it.
Me too.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.